There's a missing layer of our original internet and of our evolving frontier technologies like blockchains and AI, and that missing layer is identity.
It seems that there is like a third wave in which people now are aware that all their information might be out there. They might actually be private about it.
The original sin of the connected internet that we know and love today, it was display advertising. However, now more than 51% of online transactions and interactions come from non-human actors, right? Unidentified, unaccountable bots.
Right now, we really need to find solutions, and you are focused on many of these solutions.
Now, in the age of AI, we have an opportunity to revisit and rewrite the rules about how we are represented in digital space to be aware of and to account for these new methods of information transaction and information commerce that now we recognize as surveillance capitalism.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lorena Nessi from CCN, and today I'm joined by Evin McMullen, co-founder and CEO of Billions Network. In this conversation, we will discuss the growing debate around central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, the role of identity verification in digital payments, and the challenge of balancing regulatory compliance with privacy. So we will look at infrastructures, digital finance, and stablecoins. I can't wait to see what Evin has to say. Thank you so much, Evin, for joining us today at CCN.
Certainly, Doctor. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, me too. So I know, reading a bit about your background, that you studied something in anthropology, and I would really like to know from your personal perspective, what took you to decide to study this regulation, technology, digital identities? I find it really fascinating.
Certainly. So when I was a student, an undergraduate student at Yale University, I had the privilege of studying not only subjects like computer science and machine learning, but also anthropology and understanding how people share information about themselves and how they communicate that to others. And so the concept of self-presentation, of selective disclosure, how you decide which information to share about yourself with others who you encounter in digital space, that was really the crux of my focus and research. I had some really brilliant and wonderful professors who also introduced me to the interesting intersection between the regulatory environment, burgeoning technology, and human behavior. And so this sort of discipline, mixing things like human-computer interaction with regulatory evolution, all in the context of digital networks and public key infrastructure, was really where kind of I initially found my spark as a student. I also had a really incredible professor in the computer science space who went on to found a project called Lightning Labs, which is a Bitcoin payments network. But back in 2009, 2010, she was just my amazing computer science professor who introduced us to concepts like PGP, pretty good privacy keys, and then to Bitcoin, to the original Bitcoin paper in an academic context. And so it's sort of through exploring the fundamentals of human behavior and information disclosure and information exchange outside of the Margaret Mead-style anthropological environments that, we first encounter in academia, and really bringing that into the digital spaces where we spend most of our time as, citizens of the internet.
That is really interesting. I remember those days in which there was this cartoon of, on the internet, everyone knows you're a dog, because it was so private. I don't know if you remember, there was...
Yes, exactly. On the internet. Yes, on the internet, no one can tell you're a dog. And that is exactly what brings us to the conversation here today. There is a missing layer of our original internet and of our evolving frontier technologies like blockchains and AI. And that missing layer is identity. Being able to discern who your counterparty is enough about them to perform the type of exchange or interaction that you desire. Now, in the days when that cartoon first became popularized on the internet, no one knows you're a dog, that was before, for example, payments online. had become a prominent way of exchanging value in digital space. That was also before the dawn of your area of study and expertise in social media and different ways of representing ourselves and exchanging information in digital space. And so accordingly, we need to evolve the maturity of our technology beyond the, ancient cartoon jokes that we started with.
Yes, absolutely. And it was like that. It was so private. Suddenly everything became all the opposite. And in my view, everyone knew what was happening behind your screen. And it seems that, I don't know what you think, but it seems that there is like a third wave in which people now are aware that all their information might be out there. They might actually be private about it, right? Going back to the basics, but in a transparent way. And that's probably what blockchain can offer.
I completely agree. And I think that, the original sin of the connected internet that we know and love today, it was display advertising. The use of data about individuals perusing and browsing the web then informed the type of content that should be recommended to them. And those places, those digital billboards then, auctioned off to different brands and providers of that content. That makes really the economic foundation of the internet that we experience today. However, now more than 51% of online transactions and interactions come from non-human actors, right? Unidentified, unaccountable bots. And that means that we need to revisit the economic underpinnings of this landscape because those agents are not perusing banner ads to make their decisions, but rather have already been trained on bodies of data, making recommendations to those users that have nothing to do with the display advertising content around them. However, in the intermediary period between the introduction of this technology and now, you rightly note that many individuals have come to learn, observe, and understand the ways in which their data is harvested to then be reserved to them in the form of content that they may or may not want. Perhaps more crucially, though, is the ick factor that comes from realizing that, the disclosure of your information to parties outside of your control means that there are companies spending all day trading secrets about you without your awareness, participation, or benefit. And so now, in the age of AI, we have an opportunity to revisit and rewrite the rules about how we are represented in digital space to be aware of and to account for these new methods of information transaction and information commerce that, now we recognize as surveillance capitalism.
Yes, absolutely. It is just fascinating. And there are so many famous quotes, right? Like data is the new oil, or yes, if you are not paying for the product, you are the product. But right now, we really need to find solutions. And you are focused on many of these solutions, working with digital identity and the systems that might shape how we're actually managing these identities, isn't it?
Certainly. So at Billions Network, we are here on a mission to save the internet in the age of AI. Our team are the stewards of the most popular technologies on Earth to be able to perform things like zero knowledge proofs, or the ability to prove something about your data. So prove, for example, that you're over the age of 21 without revealing your birthday, without revealing the underlying information that makes that trait so. And so today, our team supports not only more than 9,000 projects around the world in government and enterprise, as well as technology and independent research spaces, but we also collaborate closely with the developers of open technical standards. What this means is basically the data that we use to communicate between machines and humans and AI agents on the internet. So our team has spent many years contributing to those standards and working with regulators around the world so that, for example, we can bring things like KYC into digital financial spaces, proving that the different parties of a financial interaction are safe, are legal, are compliant without revealing unnecessarily sensitive data about those different parties. We think that this is the most vital and pressing area of development in the internet, given that now, so much of our content is created by unknown or non-human parties. And so in order to derive benefit from digital space, we need to know who we're interacting with. And so that's the problem we're here to solve.
Absolutely. And of course, regulators are always arguing that stronger compliance requires more personal data collection. And not only regulators, but also corporations at large. So how do you manage after checking the key, or apart from the KYC, how do you manage, or how do you make it technically possible to actually meet these strict compliance requirements without creating a large centralized database of sensitive information? And how is it possible as well across different jurisdictions?
So that's a great question, right? How do we prevent honeypots of centralized data, massive collections of sensitive information all in one place? That for many years has been the only method of compliance, is having a check at the front door of a website or application that would request access to something like your passport, your driver's license, and then would keep a copy in their database while you go and visit their website or visit their application. Now, this particular setup is very dangerous because it creates a concentrated amount of sensitive, valuable information all in one place. And so if you have a bad actor, a hacker, hijacker, someone who is trying to access that information inappropriately, if they're able to do so, they're able to sort of, break the walls, to break the encryption, to be able to access that data, then it can be extremely harmful. And in fact, more than 1 billion people worldwide have already had sensitive information about themselves exposed by organizations that were supposed to protect them, such as government entities. And so we know that this negative outcome, this negative possible outcome, actually happens very frequently. And so it's really important for us to design a different system, because we know that the current best practices, or most popular practices, let's say, are fraught with danger, with potential, concern for corruption. And so from a sort of design perspective, the first challenge is, how do we prevent the collection of that centralized data all into one place? At Billions Network, we make it easy for you to retain your original information, such as copy of your passport or your national ID card. And the only information that ever leaves your device is like a digital thumbs up or a green light to that website or application that proves that you are qualified and allowed to enter without revealing that underlying original information. So instead of handing over a passport at the opening page of a website to prove that you're 21 years old, you can instead send a proof of age based on your passport, but not reveal the content of that actual passport. So then what gets collected are proofs of qualification, as opposed to the original documents themselves. And so what this allows us to do is to keep your private data secret and safe on your device, such as your phone or your laptop. And it allows websites and service providers to make sure that they're being compliant, because they're only allowing permitted users to enter and interact in their space, but they are not collecting a centralized database full of this sensitive information. Now, this may seem pretty space age when we talk about these capabilities, right? Being able to prove something without even seeing it. But in fact, this example has been around for a really long time. I believe it was in 1997 that Professor Larry Lessig, who's a professor at Harvard Law School, suggested that in the future, you would be able to visit an age-gated establishment such as a bar or a restaurant. And instead of revealing your full driver's license, your organ donor status, your height, your home address, instead of revealing all of that information, over disclosing it to the door person, instead, you would be able to present them with a green light or a thumbs up that mathematically proves that you are qualified to be there without revealing your underlying information. And so, although it's been a few decades since that example was initially provided, that actually has given the outline and, set of capabilities that we now today, with, great progress in cryptographic development, that we're actually able to do that. And so, we've seen thousands of government, enterprise, and developer entities around the world already start to embrace these technologies as well.
That's amazing. Do you think that in the future it's going to replace other identity systems like biometrical identification, for example?
I think in the next 5 years, we will see zero-knowledge proofs embraced by governments around the world as a standard method of age verification as well as other types of traits and qualification. You asked earlier how it is possible for multiple jurisdictions, multiple governments to be able to, fulfill their compliance requirements based on the same data. And that's actually one of the great benefits of our approach at Billions Network, is that based on what is requested of you by a website, by a service provider, by a government, and the raw data that you already have, you can generate different types of proofs that are special to what's been requested to you. So, for example, with the very same passport, I might have one government entity asking me to prove that I'm a passport holder. So I can generate a proof that says that I control and hold a passport from that specific country and send it off to that government entity for approval without revealing my passport number. Next, I can use that very same form of a passport that I have on my phone with Billions Network, and I can prove to a different government or enterprise entity that I'm over the age of 21. Using the birth date in my passport as the basis of generating that proof, but not revealing my date of birth. Instead, just sending off that green light or thumbs up, proving that I am, in fact, over age. And so what this means is that based on the same vital documents, based on the same information that makes you, you can represent yourself in the way that is required or requested from different government entities. And so this ability to transform data safely from its original form into a signed digital proof without anything getting lost in the middle, that is the power of cryptography. That is the mathematical process of creating a zero-knowledge proof on your device, a process that's sometimes called client-side proving. And that basically takes the guesswork out of the process for an application or a service to make sure that they're being safe and that they're being compliant.
That's amazing. It's the magic of maths, I suppose.
I completely agree.
But probably that's why I call them magical. But in these terms, what do you think that traditional financial institutions, when they hear about these options, what do they still misunderstand about these privacy technologies and how they will evolve in decentralized systems?
So what I would say is actually, I think a lot of financial institutions are incredibly mature in their understanding of these technologies. Back in 2018, the UK Open Banking Initiative first demonstrated in sort of a well-supervised fashion the way in which reusable KYC could be carried across institutions using these very same technologies. However, because of the regulatory environment, that was not yet permissible. But from a technical perspective and from a business operations perspective, it absolutely was. What I can also say is that partners like Deutsche Bank, like HSBC, have been, market leading in their innovative adoption exploration with these technologies. I think also, regions such as the European Union have, seen great benefit of the European Commission's appetite for frontier technologies. And we also have seen an incredible amount of enthusiasm and progress from the GCC as well, both in the government and institutional and banking side. And so the gap in understanding, I think, is less technical and functional and more related to implementation. So we have a lot of, partners and collaborators in the financial and institutional space that understand and appreciate these technologies. And the challenging part that they're working on now is understanding how to implement them at scale. So we have, I think, as an ecosystem, matured beyond the question of what does this thing do? And now we have arrived at the question of, how do we safely and in a compliant way implement this at scale?
Well, that sounds very positive. If we are going now to the next step, But also this takes us to other complexities, as you have pointed out, how the CBDC debate, right? The US Senate has recently passed legislation that would block the Federal Reserve from actually issuing these digital currencies. But there are concerns that these policymakers are trying to address, and concerns that actually are not limited to the US either, right? But many other places in which these digital currencies could be implemented very soon.
Certainly. And I would note that, in the United States, for example, the Genius Act still mandates full KYC AML for stablecoin issuers. And so we still have not yet seen what the implementation of those requirements looks like in a mature form. Generally, I think CBDC bans invalidate the thesis of what is being built in the market. Validate. CBDC bans validate the thesis of what's happening in the market, meaning that regulatory bodies recognize their citizens' rejection of government surveillance of their financial lives. And so maintaining the sovereignty of individual citizens and their freedom to transact is not necessarily at odds with the existence of a central bank digital currency. But without a method of being able to secure that currency in a fashion that respects the rights and autonomy of citizens, that there is not a reasonable way forward without technologies that allow for both. And so, I think what's exciting about zero knowledge proofs and the solution that we have with Billions Network is that we solve for exactly this gap between the Genius Act and between the CBDC ban. Which is that, we can enable provable compliance without a surveillance trade-off that killed the concept of the CBDC alone.
That's amazing. So you think these are actually ethical safeguards that should be built into this identity infrastructure from the very beginning without actually having to go into a CBDC system. Is that right?
I completely agree. I think that thoughtful guidance and legislation around identity systems will prevent the need to create the law of the horse. Are you familiar with the framing, the sort of the phrase, the law of the horse in the United States sometimes describes the concept of having laws that are so narrow and so specific and so tailored to one particular topic, such as horses, that the law may actually not be broad enough to be applicable and relevant, protecting citizens and fostering healthy business in the way that was intended. And so if we only write the laws of the horse, right, if we only legislate specific assets like CBDCs, then we may not benefit as a nation, as citizens, as beneficiaries, participants of the economy. We may not benefit from all of the breadth and thoughtfulness that could come from more broadly designed regulation that's appropriate to its subject matter. And so I think that it's also a very interesting moment in history right now where many nations are recognizing digital identity as critical national infrastructure, fundamental to the security of their borders and the operations of their economy. And so in that transition of maturing identity systems from spreadsheets with numbers into a trust layer of our digital lives, that this affords us an opportunity not only to be thoughtful, but also to open new realms and new areas of innovation and finance.
And what do you think that should be the biggest changes that could make these identity systems more transparent and trustworthy across different places, different countries, different laws?
So I think standards and security. Right now, we we can benefit from the fact that the World Wide Web Consortium, the good people who brought us the internet, have actually developed interoperable technical standards for things such as signed proofs from the government that you are, in fact, who you say you are, or that you are a citizen. For example, more than 100 different government passport issuers around the world include NFC chips in the physical passports that they issue. And those NFC chips, when you tap them with your phone using the Billions application, they actually have a copy of your passport in that digital form that is signed by the government. And you can check that government signature using our technology to make sure that it hasn't been tampered with. What this means basically is that there is a sort of a simple technical existing way using the phone you already have to be able to prove that the government has issued this information about you. And so what that means is, because it's in a standard form, it's tamper-proof, and you can check the signature. That means that any other government entity or private entity could choose to build on top of that data, could consume it, could verify it. And so continuing to leverage standards that allow one entity to recognize data issued from an entity outside itself or from a different entity, different organization, that is, I think, one of the most fundamental, essential elements to this design. Now, what I think we need to avoid is having private companies at scale make up their own form of data that no one else can read and no one else can write, and only they can use, only they can interpret, and then collecting citizen identity data in that fashion in a way that's going to be tied to a single private company that controls the definition of what it means to be human. And so instead, turning to a global coalition, open standards, and interoperable data, I think that puts us in a much stronger and more efficient position to be able to scale globally, as we've seen with the adoption of such data.
Evin, that is very interesting, but tell me, why don't you think that it's a little bit too late for these corporations to actually have hold of these massive amounts of personal data, sensitive personal data?
So I think it's important for us to look on a foregoing basis, right? What are these businesses and entities going to do next? Now, you very correctly note that for many years, the economic and operational incentive has been for businesses to collect as much data as possible, and then to apply that data in various different aspects of their recommendations or interactions with customers in the future, even predictions. What we fail to observe in that setup of sort of, call it classical surveillance capitalism, is that it is very costly to these businesses to continuously collect data. It is very expensive for them to protect and secure that data. It is even more expensive for them to comply with laws like GDPR or CCPA that may require these businesses to review the data that they've collected, describe how they have used it, explain where exactly they've used it, or even delete specific data records tied to specific users. Now, most of their databases were never built to perform those 3 or 4 tasks. They were simply built as a one-way collection machine of inbound information, and not designed to easily be able to maneuver, to attribute usage, or even to remove specific data related to a specific user. And so the business burden of complying with these regulations when you have such a massive amount of daily increasing data, that actually is not sustainable and is becoming incredibly risky for many of the businesses who operate in this way. So, for example, if you are collecting data incorrectly or inappropriately in certain jurisdictions, especially if that data pertains to children or users under the age of 13, let's say, there can be massive fines for your business in the order of tens of millions of dollars. So the operational complexity of these new flows, the additional headcount of being able to support from your business, being able to support these processes, and the financial burden of what happens when you don't do it correctly, I think are all very effective deterrents for businesses to continue operating in the way that they have traditionally. Now, especially when you can achieve compliance, maintain a similar level of personalization and output, and not have to collect all this data, manage it, store it, secure it, comply with it. This is sort of the holy grail outcome for many of our partners who realize that they can enjoy many of the benefits from a business operations perspective that they did before. They can continue to facilitate compliance, but they no longer have to engage in this complex and costly process of data retention that kind of offers a new way forward.
Wow. And do you think that applies to the compilation of data that happens on the internet on different social media platforms? And I'm saying this obviously, from based on how these websites or social media collect the data, and there have been all of these scandals, right, about what have they done with the data. But also, when you are going to the US, I was asked, for example, have you been to these countries? What's your social media? So obviously there are these connections, right? And this data is used in specific ways. So how does that work?
So I think that we are now starting to see the blurring of lines between verticals of different digital businesses that we used to think were pretty discrete. So, for example, when I was in university first learning about Bitcoin, I wouldn't think of a platform like Instagram in like 2012 as an e-commerce platform. But obviously, it has evolved and matured in many ways to facilitate new kinds of interactions. Similarly, many would not think of Facebook as the largest repository of user-generated images that the world has ever seen. And yet, even though it, has an intention to exist as one type of platform, it has taken on emergent traits of another based on the way that it has been used and based on the features that have been added. And so many platforms that we traditionally categorized as social have now become multifaceted, have become super apps in some ways, mirroring some of the evolution of social platforms that we've seen in more Eastern regions. Um, I think that this blending of utilities to create a broader super app experience that is owned or directed by a single brand versus this more fragmented experience of multiple applications, I think that we are seeing that move globally. But what that also means is that the rules around how data created in those environments, exchanged by their different verticals, utilized across their borders, becomes extremely messy. So I don't think there is a clean and clear solution that will limit or define what is quote unquote social data anytime in the near future. But what I can say is that there is a much closer relationship between um, regulation and social platforms today that is being forged around the concept of age-based access control. So where I think there is a significant and interesting overlap is in regions like the United Kingdom, Australia, Spain. We're starting to see this conversation in the GCC as well, regions where users under the age of 16 have been banned from social media. Now, there are, as you correctly note, many demonstrable and proven harms that befall young people when they are exposed to certain data inappropriately, especially social content that can have, massive impacts, negative impacts on their mental health and well-being, and the health and stability of their development. And so, it is, of course, a worthy cause to try to protect children in digital spaces. However, it cannot occur at the expense of adult safety and data sovereignty. And so we are seeing in some of these instances, the well-intended objective of protecting children is actually being overshadowed by the over-collection of data by social platforms in an attempt to protect these kids. And so it's these sorts of examples where there's a very urgent and pressing concern where I think it's vital for both regulators and technical leaders to be mindful about the way in which they implement this solution. The cure cannot be more harmful than the disease. And so in these moments, for example, that feel almost unrelated, let's say, child safety online versus things like, KYC and identity verification, they're actually deeply intertwined. And so the more thoughtfully and carefully we can implement protections that relate to children and institutions as well, the more interoperable we can make this across the internet, the safer we can make it for users, and the more accessible we can make it for government compliance.
Well, it's great to think in such a positive way. I really hope that these new systems actually create new structures in which privacy dominates and it's shaped, in these positive ways. How do you personally see it, let's say, in the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years? Are we heading towards a more private world, or how is it looking to you? Do you have more of a Black Mirror view of it?
Well, I will say I enjoy watching the Netflix TV show Black Mirror,
I love
but
it.
it's entertaining to me in the same way that science fiction was, when I was growing up. Um, but I think what, many of these sensationalized stories fail to capture, and the reason that I remain relentlessly optimistic is that um, the joined forces of human intention and regulatory clarity often work hand in hand. And what we see when we watch Black Mirror is usually the extremes of one or the other, either an extreme of regulatory oversight or an extreme of human intention that goes unfettered and unlimited. And so, I think real life tends to be a little bit more of a middle path like that, in taking into account, of course, dynamics from both of these forces. But I think in the next 5 years, we will see every application online rewritten from its current form. Every online website, application, and service will need to be rewritten from the ground up to accommodate for AI. So we are getting a clean slate here in the next 5 years. Now, how we choose to design around it, that's a totally separate discussion. But I think we have already started to see the way in which traditional browsing, semantic search, things like Google, are decreasing precipitously in favor of having AI agents or LLM-enabled tooling do the browsing for us. I think in 5 years, we will have inverted the labor of search on the internet, loading that onto a non-human actor to discover information and present it to us. And so what this means is that we will each have a separate experience of the internet that will be moderated by AI agents. And it is the design of those AI agents that will inform the level of privacy that we enjoy. Now, whether these agentic browsing behaviors can be intermediated by zero-knowledge proofs, so they can prove, for example, you're an adult without revealing your birthday to the ensuing website that they're visiting, or be able to create recommendations for you without selling and revealing the underlying information about yourself. We know that this is technically possible, but this is, again, a question of implementation details. When we are all running an AI agent on our behalf, like our own digital butlers, are they operating locally on our devices, or are we relying on some kind of public cloud infrastructure where that data may be accessible more publicly? So I think in the next, call it 1 to 2 years, we will all collectively make these design decisions, and then we'll see in the next 5 years what it looks like.
It's definitely going to look very different, right? It's already looking different for us, I think. With all of these changes that you mentioned, and they are just increasingly fast. It's like, oh my God, now my Google results are not as good, like not half as good as my AI agents results, right? So it has to change. But you are right. I think regulation needs to go faster. Hopefully, it will go fast enough to put these elements in place, because the future will definitely be so much different from the present that we're seeing right now.
I completely agree. And I think the rapid speed of iteration with AI tooling is something that we've never seen before as a species, as a human species. The ability to create infinitely and to iterate and improve, to generate new ideas is, a profound pairing with the provable scarcity of blockchain-based technologies. So on one hand, we have infinite generation. On the other hand, we have provable scarcity and verifiable identity. And so that's also why I think these technologies necessarily must go hand in hand. We cannot enable a connected world of agentic browsing and agentic commerce unless we know who we are serving information to and who we are paying. And so these very simple, fundamental questions about implementation, I think, are really where we're going to focus our effort as an industry for the next year or two, so that we can answer these broader questions of, what does this look like in real life?
Yeah. And it's not the same as it was 5 or 10 years ago, that it was humans trying to work everything out. Now we have
Certainly
other
not.
entities, right? Which should speed
That's
the
very true. In
process.
fact, I learned recently that, a number of businesses, including entities like Spotify, have turned to non-human engineers to be creating most of the new code for their platforms. Certainly in our own engineering practice here at Billions Network, we rely on AI-enabled tools, but because of the nature of those technologies, human review and discretion is always imperative in how we implement at the end of the day. And so I think the concept of cognitive security, of being able to protect the sort of opinions, thought patterns, capabilities, and autonomy of human users within an intentionally designed digital system with, many other non-human actors, I think that is going to be a critical part of our path forward. And I know that this sounds, may sound like a little bit of a space age term to your audience, right? Cognitive security. How do we defend human value in the age of AI? But I think these are all just different facets of the same concept that we've been discussing, right? How do we facilitate the future of digital compliance where users are in the driver's seat and we have a new ways of distributing value, new ways of interacting online.
No, I absolutely agree. And also, I think that even if these are somehow complex concepts, these are the concepts and the ideas, the things that humans will have to be working on, while we have these other entities working on more of the technical side, right? We'll have to be
Certainly.
implementing those and understanding them from now.
Certainly. And I think you point out a really good element here as well, which is that, identity is not limited only to human beings. At Billions Network, we make it easy for you to extend identity to your AI agents. So, for example, you can assign a unique identity to an instance of an AI agent so it can prove it is acting on behalf of you, a citizen of a specific country, over a certain age with certain qualifications. And without that element of identification, without that element of security, your agent cannot prove who it's acting on behalf of, and therefore cannot perform things such as financial interactions in compliant spaces, right? Your agent can't do a KYC process. And so I think one other element that, bears repeating about our conversation today here is that the urgency of development in, regulated digital spaces is very pressing. But the limitations, or rather the lack of guidance around the identity layer, both for human beings and for AI agents, prohibits the types of interactions that could really be made most efficient, the types of improvements that could be made most efficient. And so thirdly, what we are left with is a fragmented and not terribly secure landscape of how data is treated today. We are going to see, I think, adoption of these new tools slowly, then suddenly, not all at once. So that fragmentation, I think, is likely going to get worse before it gets better. Also, in terms of different jurisdictions having different kinds of laws and technologies that can't move smoothly in between them. But I think in about 5 years that we will definitely have a much smoother, more global view on what this data interoperability can look like, and one that is designed from the ground up with both human beings and their agentic counterparts in mind.
Well, it's exciting. We will see, the beginning of this in 5 years and where it takes us. Thank you so much, Evin, for speaking to us at CCN. I have really enjoyed our conversation. It's been great.
This is an absolute treat. Thank you guys so much. I look forward to rejoining you in 5 years to see how our predictions have gone. But if you're interested in learning more about our work, you can always find me on X at Proven Authority, or you can find us at billions_NTWK. Thank you guys so much for having us today. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you. And I'm sure we'll connect before 5 years. So we'll see you soon.
I will see you online and on chain.
Yes, that's for sure. Thank you, Evin. Bye-bye.